3 weeks. That was how long the storm season had held the valley road closed, and Rosalind Hartwell had spent all 3 of those weeks doing the work of 4 people in a farmhouse that smelled of wet wool and tallow candles, with no one to notice whether she did it well or whether she did it at all. The Halloway estate, what remained of it, which was not much, sat at the high end of a dale in the North Riding of Yorkshire, and in December it sat there with the particular grim patience of a thing that had stopped expecting rescue. The main house had been shuttered for 11 years. The dower cottage, where Rosalind lived with her cousin Edith and Edith's 4 children and Edith's 3 complaints about the coal ration, was warm enough if you kept the kitchen fire stoked through the night. Rosalind kept it stoked. She had been doing so since March, when Edith's husband Gerald had ridden to York on estate business and failed to return with anything resembling a solution to any of the 17 problems the estate was facing. Gerald was still in York. The 17 problems were still here. The great house at the top of the hill glittered faintly through the snow in those December nights, its shuttered windows catching moonlight, its empty rooms holding silence the way old houses do, with a kind of deliberate stubbornness. Rosalind occasionally looked at it from the kitchen window while she worked through the account ledger by firelight. She did not regard it with longing. She regarded it as one more thing that required managing. She had put the children to bed by 7, reviewed the creditor correspondence by 9, and drafted a letter to the wool merchant in Ripon, her 3rd such letter, carefully worded this time to suggest that payment was forthcoming, while not precisely promising that it was, which was the sort of language that took considerable skill to produce, and which no one would ever credit her for producing. By 10:30, she was banking the kitchen fire, preparing to take her own lamp up the stairs, when the knock came. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or the impatient knock of a tradesman. It was the knock of a man who had come a very long way in very difficult conditions and was not at all certain what he would find on the other side of the door. 3 solid blows, evenly spaced. She stood still for a moment with her hand on the fire iron. Then she set the fire iron down, picked up her lamp, and opened the door. He stood in the frame of it like something the storm had decided to deposit on her step. Tall, dark-coated, hatless because the hat had evidently been lost somewhere on the moor, his dark hair plastered flat with snow and water, his shoulders carrying a solid inch of white accumulation. He was breathing steadily, not frantically, which told her his was not a man easily frightened, only a man extremely cold. His horse was visible behind him, tied to the post she used for the milk cart, and it looked more dignified than he did at the moment, which was the way of horses. He said, "I beg your pardon for the hour," and his voice was precise and controlled even while his jaw was clearly working to suppress a shiver. Rosalind looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. She noted the quality of the wool coat, the fact that it had not been lined for this kind of weather, and the cut of his cravat, which was perfectly executed beneath a 1/2 inch of ice crystals. She noted that he had not mentioned his name or his title or his destination. She noted that he was, quite simply, extraordinarily cold. "Come in," she said. "Leave your boots at the threshold." He came in. She had the pot of soup she had made for tomorrow's midday back on the hook before he had finished removing his boots, and while he stood in her kitchen holding his own coat and looking at it as though uncertain what one did with a coat in a house where no footman appeared, she took it from him, hung it on the peg near the fire, and pointed to the chair closest to the hearth. "Sit there," she said. "It will take 10 minutes to heat through." He sat, and for a long moment he looked at her, not with the vague, entitled appraisal of a man who had stumbled into a woman's kitchen and was only half attending, but with the specific, measuring attention of someone who had just encountered something they did not expect and were carefully recalibrating to account for it. Rosalind returned to the fire and stirred the pot and did not ask his name. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She had been managing the Halloway accounts for 2 years and 8 months, since the autumn of 1817, when Gerald had stood in the doorway of the estate office and said, simply, that he could not make the figures make sense, and was she any good with numbers, and she had said that she was adequately competent, which was so far from the truth it nearly constituted a separate form of correspondence. She was not adequately competent with numbers. She was extraordinary with them, in the way that people who have had to survive on precision tend to be. She had learned figures at her father's knee. Her father, who had been a land steward in Derbyshire before the accident, and who had kept running accounts of the estates he managed in 2 parallel ledgers, one official and one annotated with his own observations, and who had taught Rosalind to do the same, because he could not afford to teach her anything that would not eventually be useful. Her father had died when she was 19 and left her with his annotated method, his 2 sets of ledger books, and £43. The £43 had gone to clearing his modest debts. The method and the ledger books had gone with her to Edith's household, where she had arrived with no prospects and a small trunk, and had been absorbed into the domestic machinery of the house within a fortnight, the way water is absorbed by dry ground, quickly, completely, and without ceremony. That had been 4 years ago. She was now 23, and she had, in those 4 years, negotiated 3 creditor payment schedules, recovered £68 in overbilled supply accounts, renegotiated the lease on the lower tenant farm, dismissed and replaced the estate's fraudulent wool contractor, a man who had been skimming £11 per quarter for at least 3 years and possibly longer, though she could only prove the 3, and produced in the autumn of 1818 a consolidated estate account that had reduced the Halloway annual deficit from £412 to £67. She had then presented this to Gerald, who had nodded with the mild satisfaction of a man who had not looked closely enough at anything to understand how extraordinary the reduction was, and who had then asked whether she might also sort the linen inventory. She had sorted the linen inventory. Then she had returned to the accounts. No one had ever paid her for any of it. Her arrangement with Edith was a roof and meals and £12 annually for what Edith called general household assistance. The estate management was not, formally speaking, part of this. It had simply needed doing, and Rosalind was there, and she knew how, and she was not going to watch the thing collapse for want of attention when she had the attention to give. There had been one moment, a single winter evening in the 2nd year, when she had discovered the wool contractor's fraud and sat with the evidence arranged on the desk and understood that she had just saved the estate something in the range of £40 per year going forward, when she had felt the full weight of what her situation was, the quality of what she did set against the total absence of recognition for doing it. She had sat with that for a long time. She had thought about it clearly and without self-pity, the way her father had taught her to look at a set of accounts, at what was actually there, not what she wished were there. Then she had picked up her pen and drafted the letter dismissing the contractor. She was not going to become less than she was because her circumstances were inadequate. That had been the decision. She returned to it occasionally the way one returns to a compass bearing, not dramatically, not with great ceremony, simply to confirm she was still heading the right direction. She brought the soup to the table in the good bowl, the one without the chip, and a piece of bread from the morning's bake, and set them in front of the man in the chair by the fire, who had by now stopped shivering perceptibly and was watching her with that same careful attention. "I am in your debt," he said. "I should give you my name." "You should," she agreed, and went back for a cup of tea. "Percival Ashworth," he said. "I was riding from Harrogate to Northmoor Park, and the road turned before I had an adequate map." Northmoor Park was the estate that abutted the upper boundary of Halloway, the one owned by the Duke of Asherton, which had been closed and unoccupied for 11 years, about which the valley had developed the elaborate mythology that provincial communities develop around any absent aristocratic neighbor. Rosalind set the cup of tea on the table beside the soup bowl and considered for a moment the name he had just given her. Ashworth. There was an Ashworth in the solicitor's correspondence she had been reading only last week, a letter from Halloway's solicitor in York, mentioning that Northmoor Park had recently changed hands within the family, that the new holder had sent agents to conduct an initial assessment of the estate, and that the Valley Road easement that had been informally shared between Halloway and Northmoor for 40 years might be worth reviewing on paper. She had made a note to attend to that easement. She had not made any inquiries about the new holder, because there had been 17 more pressing things to attend to. She stood at her kitchen table and looked at the man eating her soup, and understood that she was looking at the new holder of Northmoor Park. She sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table, and said, "The road from Harrogate turns at the 3rd stone marker past the mill. The 4th marker is a weather post, not a direction post, and in December they look identical." She paused. "You are the new Duke of Asherton." He looked up from the soup. For the first time since she had opened the door, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, precisely, but the particular recalibration of a man who has just discovered he is talking to someone considerably more formidable than the situation initially suggested. "I am," he said. "And you are?" "Rosalind Hartwell. I manage the Halloway estate accounts." She did not add that she did so unofficially, without salary beyond £12, for a cousin who spent most of his time in York. Those were details for another conversation. "Your easement document," she said, "is likely in Northmoor's lower archive, which no one has opened in 11 years. If your agents cannot find it, I can show you what the Halloway copy says, which covers the same road." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, and returned to the soup. He was learning who he was speaking to. Rosalind could see that clearly. She found she did not mind being assessed. She assessed things all day. It was a more honest mode of attention than most of the alternatives. He finished the soup and most of the bread. She refilled the tea. Outside, the storm was not diminishing, and there was no question of the road before morning. She showed him the small room at the back of the cottage, the one the children used for their studies, with the narrow settle, the one decent blanket, and the school primers stacked along the wall, and told him that his horse was sheltered in the Halloway hay barn, which was the only outbuilding with a working door. She had gone out in her coat and boots and stabled the horse herself while he finished eating, because the horse was cold and it had not been the horse's fault. She said good night. He said good night. She lay in her narrow bed upstairs and listened to the storm and thought about the easement document, and about the fact that the Valley Road, if it was to be formally reviewed, would need to be surveyed, and that a survey would intersect with the lower tenant farm lease she had renegotiated 18 months ago, which had a boundary clause she had written specifically to protect Halloway's access to the mill track, and that all of it was going to require a conversation she was not sure Edith or Gerald were equipped to have. She was asleep before she finished the thought. What Rosalind did not know was what the Duke of Asherton had been carrying when the storm brought him to her door. He had come north not because he was ready to, but because his solicitor had told him, for the 5th time, in language carefully chosen to be impossible to misinterpret, that Northmoor Park had been standing empty for 11 years, and that was 11 years of deferred maintenance and diminishing tenancy income and a structural reputation in the valley that was going to take deliberate effort to repair. Percival had understood this on each of the 5 occasions it was explained to him. He had also understood it the way one understands a thing one does not yet know how to approach. His mother had died at Northmoor, not dramatically, not in any manner that would have made a good story, but quietly in the east bedroom, in the February of 1808, of a fever that had gone on for 3 weeks before anyone thought to bring a physician from York. Percival had been 17 and away at school, and by the time he arrived the bedroom smelled of lavender and absence. He had stood in the doorway for a very long time. He had not been back since. The estate had been managed by a series of increasingly dispirited agents. The tenancies had slowly reduced. The house had been closed room by room, and Percival had managed all of it at a careful distance through correspondence and quarterly reports. The way one handles a fire one cannot bear to approach directly. He was 28 now. He had been the Duke of Asherton for 3 years, since his father's death, and he had spent those 3 years managing the ducal portfolio in London with a focused, deliberate attention that his solicitors found admirable and his contemporaries found somewhat alarming. He had no particular social life. He attended the required functions and said the required things and retreated to his study, where he worked. He had considered 2 marriage candidates presented by his advisors and found both of them not unpleasant, not unsuitable, but somehow unconvincing, as though they were very well-made arguments for a conclusion he could not quite bring himself to endorse. He had ridden from Harrogate to Northmoor on a route he had not properly mapped, in weather that had turned faster than expected, and the storm had pushed him off the upper road and down into the dale, and a single lit window in the dark had been the thing between him and a very cold night on the moor. He had sat in her kitchen and eaten her soup and understood, with the particular clarity that cold and exhaustion sometimes produce, that he was in the presence of someone who operated at a level of competence that did not match her surroundings. It was not something he could have articulated immediately. It was more like the recognition that occurs when a piece of architecture is sounder than the building around it suggests it ought to be. The bridge is holding more weight than anyone would have designed it to hold. Something has been built here, carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing. She had known his name before he finished his soup. She had told him where the road marker was, specifically and correctly. She had mentioned an easement document and offered him access to the Holloway copy, as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to offer a duke who had appeared uninvited at midnight, and she had done it without servility and without performance, with the plain straightforwardness of someone who simply keeps track of everything, because keeping track of everything is the only approach that works. He had lain on the narrow settle in the children's study room, surrounded by school primers and a blanket that smelled faintly of chalk, and thought about the easement document for much longer than was strictly necessary. In the morning, the storm had broken. The road was passable by 7. Rosalind made porridge and tea and fed the children and produced a clean length of cloth for him to make something useful of his ruined cravat, because his own had not survived the night in any wearable condition. He had stood in the kitchen and worked at the clean cloth and made a very poor job of the folding, and she had looked at this for approximately 40 seconds before crossing the kitchen, saying, "Allow me," and straightening it with the particular focused efficiency of someone who has been doing precise things with their hands for a long time. He held very still while she worked. "It was crooked," she said, when she stepped back. "The fold was going right instead of left. The knot would have fallen by noon." "I am grateful," he said. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has just done a practical thing and is already thinking about the next practical thing. "The Holloway copy of the easement document is in the estate office," she said. "If you wish to review it before you speak to your solicitors, you are welcome to. It will save you a correspondence." He came to the estate office. He stayed for 3 hours. The Duke's agents arrived at Northmoor Park in the first week of January, and the estate came alive in the provisional, tentative manner of a house that has been long asleep and is not yet sure it wants to be awake. Fires were lit. Shutters were opened. 12 years of accumulated correspondence was arranged in order and sent south to Percival's London solicitors, and the Valley Road was surveyed, and 2 of the lower tenancies were formally reviewed, and the gardener who had been maintaining the grounds on a half-retainer for 6 years was engaged at a full rate and told he might begin whatever structural work the walled garden required. Rosalind knew all of this because in a valley of this size, information traveled the way sound travels in a closed room, efficiently and without any particular mechanism. She also knew it because the Duke's lead agent, a man named Edward White, who was retired from a career in diplomatic administration and who moved through the world with the deliberate precision of someone who has spent 40 years translating between people who do not speak each other's language, came to the Holloway estate office twice in January with questions about the shared road easement and the history of the lower tenant boundary. On his second visit, he stayed for most of the afternoon, and when he left, he said, "His Grace spoke of you, Miss Hartwell. He said the Holloway accounts were very well kept." Rosalind said, "They are." White looked at her with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who has met a great many people and is taking accurate stock of one more. "He also said you were managing them independently." "The estate manager is in York," she said. "Someone has to." White nodded, once, with the quality of a man filing something precisely. "Yes," he said, "someone does." He came a third time in the first week of February and brought with him a formal letter from the Duke of Asherton, written in a clear and direct hand without elaborate preamble, which proposed that Rosalind be engaged as consulting estate advisor for the Northmoor Park restoration, paid at the rate of £40 per annum for 4 months of work, with a contract clause specifying that any formal recommendations she produced would carry her name as author. She read the letter twice. She read the contract clause 3 times. £40 for 4 months, with her name on the work. She pressed one hand briefly against the surface of the estate desk, not with any particular drama, simply with the steadiness of someone taking a moment to absorb something real, and then she picked up her pen and wrote her acceptance. She was at Northmoor Park for the first time since she was 14 years old. She had come once with her father, who was reviewing an estate management question with the then steward. On a Tuesday morning in early February, when the walled garden was still frost-bound, and the great house smelled of closed rooms, and beeswax, and something older, something that had to do with long absence. The Duke was not there when she arrived. Edward White showed her to the estate office, a room she recognized, which her father had once called the best-equipped estate room in the North Riding, meaning that the previous holders had cared about record-keeping, which was the highest praise her father gave, and left her with the 12 years of accumulated account books and the list of outstanding maintenance concerns and a pot of tea. She opened the first ledger. By noon, she had identified 4 separate patterns of deferred maintenance that were costing the estate in accelerating compound ways. The lake sluice gate, which had been noted as requiring attention in every annual account for 9 years and never attended to, was now requiring a repair that would cost 6 times what the original attention would have. The north wing roof, similar story. The lower pasture drainage, similar story. The kitchen garden wall, similar story. She began a summary document, annotated with the specific cost differential between deferred and timely repair, reference to the ledger pages, because figures without references were arguments rather than evidence. She was halfway through the summary document when the door opened and the Duke came in. He looked better than he had in her kitchen doorway at midnight. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been cold for a long time and had recently been warm enough to remember what warmth felt like. He wore a dark coat and his cravat was tied correctly, left over right, and he carried himself with the contained, deliberate quiet of a man who moves through large rooms without needing them to react to his presence. He looked at her desk, at the arranged ledgers, at the annotated summary she had begun. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since 9, she said. "The sluice gate is the most urgent matter. May I show you?" He came to the desk and she showed him the ledger entries, the 9 years of deferred notation, the cost comparison between what the repair had been in 1810 and what it was estimated to be now. She referenced each figure to its source page. He did not interrupt her. He looked at the figures and then at the pages and then back at the figures. "You annotate your references," he said. "My father taught me. Figures without sources are approximations. Approximations are not useful to anyone making a real decision." He looked at the summary document for a moment longer. "What else?" he said. She told him about the north wing roof, the lower pasture drainage, and the kitchen garden wall. She told him the order in which she would address them if the budget could support all four, and the order in which she would address them if it could only support two. She told him that the lake sluice gate was not optional regardless of budget, because the downstream flooding risk to the lower tenant farms made deferral not merely expensive, but legally vulnerable, and she referenced the tenant lease clause that specified the estate's obligation to maintain the water control infrastructure. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "When you renegotiated the Halloway lower tenant lease, did you write the water control clause yourself?" "Yes." "How long did it take you?" She considered. 2 evenings. The first draft was wrong. The second was adequate. I showed it to a solicitor in Harrogate who confirmed it was sound. "You paid for that consultation." 12 shillings, from the estate petty cash, which I noted in the account. Something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that emotions are usually described changing, but in the quiet way that a room changes when a window is opened and the quality of the light becomes something different from what it was. He looked at her with a directness that was not uncomfortable, precisely, but was the kind of attention that required being met rather than deflected. The person being overlooked in any room, Rosalind thought, with a kind of sudden clarity that had no useful purpose at the moment, is very often the person keeping the room standing. She returned to her summary document. The Duke came to the estate office every morning that week. He did not hover. He had the quality, which she had not expected, or had expected and had not quite believed, of someone who could occupy the same working space without making it smaller. He reviewed the documents she produced. He asked specific questions. He did not ask questions he could have answered himself with another 5 minutes of looking at the page, which was a form of consideration she had not frequently encountered. On the 4th morning he brought coffee instead of tea, because she had mentioned on the 3rd morning that the tea at Northmoor tended toward the weak. He set the coffee on the corner of her desk without comment. She looked at it and then at him, and then said, "Thank you," and returned to the drainage costings. He did not say anything. He simply sat down across from her and opened the correspondence file she had prepared. The opposition assembled, as it was going to, in the 3rd week of February. It arrived first in the form of Lady Constance Daverley, who came to Northmoor Park on a Thursday afternoon with her mother and a very good carriage, because Lady Constance was the woman that 3 of the Duke of Asherton's senior advisers and both of his maternal aunts had identified as the appropriate match for his particular situation, and she was not incorrect in her assessment of this fact. She was 24, very handsome, possessed of a good estate in Shropshire, and she had been managing the expectation of the Asherton match with the careful, graceful efficiency of a woman who has been told since she was 16 that this was the trajectory of her life. She was not cruel. She was the system made visible, shaped into a person, and she moved through Northmoor's drawing room with the particular assurance of a woman who had been furnished with every credential her world could furnish. Rosalind encountered her in the corridor outside the estate office at 3:15, when Rosalind was carrying the annotated maintenance summary and the lake sluice estimate to the Duke's morning room for his review. She was wearing her working dress, which was gray wool, neat but not new. Lady Constance was wearing a dark blue spencer over a cream muslin that had not been near a working estate in its life. Lady Constance looked at her with the pleasant, faintly puzzled expression that high-born women sometimes produce when they encounter someone they do not know how to categorize. "Can you tell me where I might find His Grace?" she said, with the mild authority of a woman accustomed to directing household staff. "He is in the library," Rosalind said. Lady Constance's gaze traveled, briefly, to the papers in Rosalind's arms. "Are those the estate accounts?" "Part of them. The maintenance prioritization summary and the sluice gate repair estimate." A pause. Something rearranged itself slightly behind Lady Constance's eyes. Not hostility, but a recalibration. "I see," she said. "And you are the estate advisor?" "I am." Rosalind met her gaze without particular warmth or particular coldness. "Miss Hartwell, the library is to the left at the top of the stairs." Lady Constance said thank you and went. Rosalind continued to the morning room, set the papers on the correct part of the desk, noted on the top page that she had referenced the tenant lease clause in the appendix, and returned to the estate office. She had been managing situations more complicated than this before breakfast for years. She could manage this. The second layer of opposition arrived 2 days later, in the person of the Duke's great-uncle, Lord Carey Ashworth, who had served as informal guardian to the Asherton estate interest during Percival's minority, and who arrived at Northmoor on a Saturday morning with a traveling coat and a number of firmly held opinions about structural propriety. He was 71, precise, not unkind, and absolutely certain that the engagement of a woman with no title, no family standing, and no social endorsement as an estate advisor, regardless of the quality of her work, was the sort of thing that invited consequences. He expressed this view to Percival in the library on Saturday afternoon, and Rosalind heard none of it directly. What she heard was Edward White's account of it, delivered on Saturday evening with the diplomat's careful neutrality. "Lord Carey considers the arrangement irregular," White said. "It is irregular," Rosalind said. "Does Lord Carey have a specific objection to the work or only to the arrangement?" White paused with the quality of a man who has precisely understood the difference and is deciding how to credit the question. "Only to the arrangement," he said. "Then the work speaks for itself," Rosalind said, "or it doesn't. Either way, that is the correct test." White looked at her for a moment with what appeared to be something close to satisfaction. "Yes," he said, "I believe that is the correct test." Lord Carey dined at Northmoor that Saturday and was introduced to Rosalind at the dinner table, where she was present in her capacity, slightly awkward in its definition, she was aware, as consulting estate advisor, a role that placed her neither entirely below stairs nor quite at the social level of the other guests. Lord Carey looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture in an unfamiliar room, assessing whether it was there by design or by accident. Over dinner, the conversation turned to the sluice gate repair, as it often did in rooms where people were trying to demonstrate that they were engaged with the reality of an estate, rather than merely visiting it. Lord Carey expressed the view that the repair might be contracted to the same firm that had done work for a neighboring estate in the previous decade. Rosalind said, quietly, that she had checked that firm's completed work records in the county register and found 2 structural complaints filed in 1815 and 1817 respectively, both involving drainage work, and that she had identified a Harrogate contractor whose rate was £11 lower and whose completed work records showed no complaints in 15 years. Lord Carey looked at her. "You reviewed the county register?" he said. "I wrote to the county office in December, when I first assessed the sluice gate as urgent. The response came last week, a silence around the table of the particular kind that occurs when a room has been presented with organized evidence and has not yet decided how to arrange itself around it." Lord Carey said nothing further about the contracting firm. He was not converted. He remained, for the duration of his visit, a man who believed that the structural proprieties of his world were legitimate, because in his world they were. But that evening, in the corridor outside the library, he stopped beside Percival and said, in a low and precise voice that he had not quite controlled as carefully as he believed, "She is very competent, I grant you that. Percival said, "Yes." Lord Carey said, "That is not sufficient, as you know." Percival said, "I know what I'm doing, uncle." A pause, the particular pause of a man who is revising a calculation he thought was settled. "She wrote to the county office in December," Lord Carey said, "not quite to anyone. 3 months before you engaged her formally." "Yes," Percival said. Lord Carey walked on. He did not make any further formal objection. The library, as it turned out, was where Rosalind found the music. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the estate records from the 1790s, which were supposed to be in the lower archive and were not, and which she suspected might have been placed in the library shelving during one of the episodic reorganizations that large houses undergo when anxious housekeepers are in charge of too much space. She had come to the library on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet and the Duke was in the north wing overseeing the preliminary roof assessment, and she had been working her way methodically along the lower shelves when she found, behind a row of bound agricultural reports, a leather music portfolio. It had a name pressed into the cover, Clara Ashworth, the Duke's mother. Rosalind opened it carefully. It held 15 or 20 sheets of manuscript music, original compositions, in a clear and practiced hand, for pianoforte. She turned through them slowly. They were very good, not accomplished in the trained, correct way of a lady's education, but genuinely constructed, harmonically careful, the kind of pieces produced by someone who thought in music rather than merely through it. She heard the door. Percival stood in the library doorway. He looked at the portfolio in her hands, and something in his face became quite still, not a collapse into emotion, but the particular stillness of a person in the presence of something they have not permitted themselves to approach. "I found it behind the agricultural reports," Rosalind said evenly. "I was looking for the 1790s estate records." "Yes," he said. He did not come further into the room. She looked at him with the directness she applied to most things. "You have not opened this room in 11 years, she said, "not because of the estate work, because of her." He did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. Rosalind looked down at the manuscript pages, at the clear hand of Clara Ashworth, who had composed music in this house and died in it, and left behind a leather portfolio behind a row of agricultural reports where no one had looked. "The pianoforte in the drawing room," she said, "is very well made. The tuning has held. It would be a shame if the compositions were never heard." She closed the portfolio and held it out to him. After a moment he came and took it. His hand was steady. He looked at the pressed name on the cover for a long time. "Will you play them?" he said. She had not played for anyone in 4 years. She had played for herself, sometimes, late in the evenings at the Holloway cottage when the children were asleep and the accounts were done, quietly, so as not to wake anyone. Her father had taught her that too, alongside the ledgers. "Yes," she said, "if you like." That evening, in the drawing room, with the fire lit and the Duke in the chair across the room, Rosalind played Clara Ashworth's compositions from the manuscript pages, one by one, slowly and carefully. She made mistakes in some of them. The fingering was demanding, and she stopped and repeated the difficult passages without apology until she had them right. The Duke said nothing throughout. He sat very still, in the way that people sit when they are receiving something that cost them a great deal to allow. When she finished the last piece, the room was quiet for a while. "She was very good," Rosalind said. "She was," he said. "I did not know she had written them herself. I thought they were copies." "They are original. The harmonic choices in the third movement are not anything I have seen in published work." He looked at her across the room. "You understand the theory," he said. "My father thought music theory and accounting were the same discipline," she said. He was not wrong. He came to the piano then, not abruptly, but with the measured movement of someone who has decided something and is committed to its direction. He stood beside the piano bench and looked at the manuscript page she had last played, and he said quietly, "She would have liked you." Rosalind pressed one hand briefly against the piano's surface and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. Some things were received rather than responded to. The matter was forced into the open in the third week of February, when the wool merchant from Ripon, the one Rosalind had been delicately managing with careful letters, arrived at Northmoor unannounced and demanded to speak to the estate manager about the Halloway outstanding account. This was a problem that had not, technically, been Rosalind's problem to present to the Duke. The Halloway debt to the Ripon wool merchant was Edith's problem and Gerald's problem, and their management of it, or non-management, was their own responsibility. But the wool merchant, whose name was Ashby, had ridden to Northmoor because the Valley Road made it the logical stopping place before continuing to the Halloway cottage, and because he had heard, as valleys hear things, that there was now a duke at Northmoor with an interest in the area's affairs. Ashby presented himself in the Northmoor estate room at 11 in the morning, where Rosalind was working, and he looked at her the way he always did, with the particular condescension of a man who has been conducting business with a woman for 2 years and has not yet entirely absorbed the fact. "I'd like to speak to the Duke," he said, "about the Halloway debt." "The Duke is assessing the North Wing," Rosalind said. "I can take the details." Ashby looked at her. "It's a matter of £114, Miss Hartwell." "I know what it is," she said. "Sit down." He sat, with the quality of a man who had intended to remain standing and was surprised to find himself in a chair. Rosalind opened her working folder and produced the Halloway account summary she had updated 2 days prior. She placed it on the desk between them and walked him through it. The current balance, the payment schedule she had drafted and Edith had not formally endorsed, the wool contractor replacement that had recovered £11 quarterly, and the estate income projections for spring that, if the lower tenant renewals held, would produce enough surplus to clear the outstanding debt in 2 payments by June. Ashby looked at the document. He looked at the figures. He was a man of business, and in the language of figures, what Rosalind had produced was organized and defensible and specific. "The June projection depends on the tenant renewals," he said. "The lower lease renewals are in my hand," she said. "I drafted the revised terms. Both tenants have indicated they intend to sign. I can show you the correspondence." She showed him the correspondence. A pause that was not entirely comfortable but was considerably more productive than the conversation he had prepared for. "You drew these up yourself?" he said, regarding the lease terms. "I did. They have been reviewed by the Harrogate solicitor." Ashby was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the specific reluctance of a man reassessing a situation he thought he understood, "The June timeline is tight." "It is," she said, "but it is accurate. I do not present projections that are not accurate." He considered her for a moment. Then he said, "No, I don't suppose you do." He agreed to the June timeline. He shook her hand, which he had never done before, and left. Percival appeared in the estate office doorway approximately 20 minutes later. He had heard enough from the corridor. She registered this from the quality of his expression, which carried the particular attentiveness of someone who has been listening to something without being certain he should. "Was that resolved?" he said. "Yes," she said. "June. If the tenant renewals hold." He came into the room. He stood beside the desk, not across from it, and looked at the account summary she had laid out for Ashby, and at the correspondence she had shown him, and at the figures she had annotated in the margins with her small, precise hand. "You drafted all of these," he said. "The lease terms and the account summary, yes. The original creditor was Gerald's, but the restructure is mine." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long have you been managing Halloway?" 2 years and 8 months. "And before that?" My father was a land steward in Derbyshire. I learned from him. What happened to your father? She told him, briefly and without embellishment. The accident, the 43 pounds, the trunk and the ledger books, and Edith's household. She did not tell it as a tragedy. She told it as the sequence of events that had produced the present situation. The way one traces a line back to its starting point, not because the starting point was significant in itself, but because it explains the direction. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "You could have been employed anywhere, with proper recommendation." "Possibly," she said, "but I was here, and it needed doing." He looked at her, the same measuring attention she had noticed the first night, but altered now, as though the measuring had concluded and something else had taken its place, something that was not simpler. "Come and see the lake this afternoon," he said. "I want to walk the sluice gate site before we finalize the contractor." She came. They walked the lake path in the late afternoon light, which was the pale gold specific to February in the North Riding, clear and cold and very still. He knew the path well. She realized this was not because he had walked it recently, but because he had walked it many times before. 1808, and the memory was in his feet, even if he had not permitted himself to return. At the sluice gate he crouched and examined the deteriorated timber work and asked her 3 specific questions about the repair estimate, and she answered all 3 with the same directness she applied to everything. On the walk back he said very little. She did not try to fill the silence. She had long understood that silence had its uses and did not require papering over. At the garden gate he stopped and turned to her and said, without any particular preamble, "My solicitors are coming from London next month. I would like you to be present for the estate review meeting." She looked at him. "In what capacity?" "As the person who has actually read the accounts." He said it plainly, without irony. "Your great-uncle will object." "My great-uncle objects to most things," he said, and then he reviews the evidence and recalibrates. He is an honest man, which is worth more than his initial opinion. Rosalind considered this. "The London solicitors may also object," she said. "Yes," he said, "they may," and he held the garden gate open for her. She had managed situations far more complicated than a room of objecting solicitors. She picked up her pace and went through. The meeting of the Northmoor Park Estate Council took place in the first week of March, in the formal dining room, which had been arranged for the purpose, with the account ledgers and maintenance summaries laid along the center of the table like a small regiment. Present were Percival himself, his 2 London solicitors, Messrs. Finn and Hadley, Edward White, in his capacity as senior agent, Lord Carey Ashworth, who had made a point of returning for the occasion, and Rosalind, introduced by Percival as the consulting estate advisor, who had produced the summary documentation before them. Finn, the senior solicitor, a man of 60 with the careful skepticism of someone who has spent 4 decades in rooms where the important information was concealed rather than presented, looked at the documentation and then at Rosalind and said, with professional courtesy only, "Miss Hartwell, the council typically convenes with the estate's appointed officers." "I understand," Rosalind said. "The summary before you was produced from my review of the Northmoor accounts over the past 5 weeks. I can speak to any specific figure in it, including the sourcing ledger page." Fenn looked at the summary. He looked at it for rather a long time. "The sluice gate prioritization," he said. "The 9-year deferred maintenance calculation. This is reference to specific ledger entries?" "Appendix C," she said. "Pages 1 through 9. Each year's notation is cited individually." He turned to Appendix C. He reviewed it in silence. Then he turned back. Hadley, the junior solicitor, spoke up. "The projected income from the tenant renewals. These are secured?" "Both tenants have signed the revised leases," she said. "I have the signed copies in the estate office." I can have them here within 10 minutes if the council would find them useful." She did not look at Lord Carey. She did not look at Lady Constance, who was not in the room, because Lady Constance was not at the estate, and had not been since the Thursday of her first visit. She looked at the solicitors and she presented the evidence, calmly and precisely, because that was the instrument she had, and it was the correct instrument for this room. Fenn said, "The Harrogate contractor for the sluice gate, your recommendation is based on the County Register review and on a direct reference from the Alderton estate in the next valley, whose agent I wrote to in January. Their drainage work was completed in 1815 and has required no repair. The reference letter is in Appendix D." A pause. "You wrote to the Alderton estate in January," Fenn said. "Before I was formally engaged," she said. "The urgency of the sluice gate was apparent in the first week of my review. I thought it better to begin the contractor research immediately." The room was very quiet. Not the silence of a room that has been shut down, but the silence of a room in which something is being recalibrated, slowly, without drama, the way ice adjusts to temperature. Fenn looked at Percival. Something passed between them, a look that had nothing to do with Rosalind and everything to do with a solicitor who has just understood that his client arrived at a decision before the decision was announced. "The documentation is thorough," Fenn said. He turned to Hadley. "The maintenance prioritization is sound." Hadley nodded. Fenn looked at Rosalind. "Miss Hartwell," he said, with the specific formal courtesy of a man extending professional acknowledgement to someone he has just correctly assessed, "the council would benefit from your continued involvement in the estate review." "I am engaged through June," she said. "The contract can be extended if the council finds it useful," Percival said. "The council finds it useful." Lord Carey, at the far end of the table, was looking at the summary document with an expression Rosalind could not quite read. Not warm, exactly, but not what it had been. Something that had adjusted itself privately and had not made an announcement about the adjustment. After the meeting, when the solicitors had repaired to the morning room, and White was organizing the documentation, Lord Carey passed Rosalind in the corridor outside the dining room. He stopped. He said, not warmly but precisely, "The County Register work was well done. I did not anticipate the reference letter from Alderton." He paused. "I should have." Rosalind looked at him. "You are protecting the estate," he said. "I see that you are." "That is the work," she said. He nodded once and walked on. It was not an apology. It was a man of integrity acknowledging, in the only language he had, what he had missed. Rosalind found it more useful than a warmer response would have been. Percival found her in the estate office that evening, after the solicitors had gone and the house had quieted. He sat across from her and said nothing for a moment, and she continued organizing the appendix materials back into their correct files, because the files would need to be maintained whether or not anything else happened. "The room was changed by you today," he said. "The room was changed by the evidence," she said. "I only organized it." He was quiet for a moment. Rosalind. He had used her given name perhaps twice before, both times without particular attention to the formality he was eliding. She did not correct it. She looked up from the files. He said, "I want to ask you something, not as the estate advisor." He paused. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted to the requirements that my position imposes, but because you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time, and the most competent, and I have spent 3 months watching you protect an estate that has given you almost nothing in return, and I find I cannot stop thinking about the lease terms you drafted in 2 evenings, and the County Register letter you sent in December, before anyone had asked you to." He stopped. He was not a man who spoke at length about what he felt. She understood this about him. "I am asking you to consider whether you would permit me to court you properly," he said. "Not because the estate requires it, because I would like very much to know you better." She looked at him for quite a long time. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, carefully, from the specific evidence available, without dismissing any of the real complications. The complications were real. She had no title, no social standing, no family of consequence. He was a duke. His uncle had objections. His solicitors had required the summary document before they would extend her professional acknowledgement in a formal meeting. She thought about the lake path in February light and the music portfolio and the coffee he had put on the corner of her desk without comment. She thought about the first night, when he had knocked on her door at midnight in a storm, and she had fed him before she knew his name. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He let out a quiet breath. Not relief, exactly, something more like the specific recognition that a thing you were not certain you had the right to want has been confirmed as possible. He stood. He looked at her, and then, with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, he took her hand, her bare hand, which she had not been aware was bare until the moment he held it, and he did not kiss it, not then. He simply held it for a moment, and she felt the warmth of that through the rest of the evening. The formal proposal happened in the morning room in April, with Edward White as witness, which was not what either of them had planned but was what the situation required. The London advisers needed a formal intention to document, and Percival had said, with characteristic economy, that he supposed they might as well have one. It was proper and correct and not a love scene. The real proposal happened on a Sunday evening in the walled garden, where the first shoots were coming up through the beds that the gardener had been tending since January, and where the late April light was doing what late April light does in Yorkshire, filling the sky slowly, gold and then rose and then a blue that had no proper name for it. He said, "I proposed to you formally in April because the solicitors required it. I propose to you now because I mean it." He was standing very close. He had not yet learned to stand close without being aware of the distance, which she found she appreciated. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, but because you play my mother's music as though it deserves to be heard. Because you wrote to the county register in December. Because you have been keeping things standing by yourself for years. And I would like," he said, and paused, and looked at her with the particular directness that she had come to understand was his version of openness, "to be standing alongside you." She pressed one hand against the garden wall beside her and thought about it completely. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Percival." He kissed her then, in the walled garden, in the light that had no name for it, and it was unhurried and entirely serious and very warm. They were married in June, at the parish church in the village at the foot of the dale, in a ceremony that was small by ducal standards, and large by any standard Rosalind had previously occupied. Edith wept. The children sat in the front pew with the focused solemnity of people who have been told to be very good and are applying themselves to it. Edward White was present, and beside him was a young woman named Charlotte Pierce, who had come up from London as a friend of the Duke's household, and who had introduced herself to Rosalind at the rehearsal the day before by saying, "I have read the maintenance prioritization document. The Appendix C citations are extraordinary," and who had thereafter been one of Rosalind's few genuine friends. Lord Carey was present. He said nothing at the reception that could be called warm, but he held Rosalind's hand for a moment, when he took his leave, and said that the estate was in capable hands, which from Lord Carey was something close to a benediction. They lived at Northmoor Park. The sluice gate was repaired in May, on schedule, by the Harrogate contractor, £11 under the competing estimate. The north wing roof followed in August. The lower pasture drainage was completed the following spring. The walled garden came back slowly, the way walled gardens do, not all at once, but by degrees, one bed at a time, the gardener bringing things back from long dormancy with patient, specific care. Rosalind continued the estate accounts in the way she had always kept them, annotated, referenced, organized in double columns. Her father's method now applied to a household of 34 and an estate of 600 acres. The format she developed for the Northmore account management, the parallel ledger with source citations, the seasonal cost projection model, the maintenance deferral cost calculation that tracked what inaction accumulated, was copied, with her permission, by 3 neighboring estates in the following 2 years. The solicitor Fenn wrote to her directly on one occasion to request a clean copy of the method for a client whose estate accounts were in disorder. She sent it with a cover letter that explained the referencing system. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1821. They named her Clara, which was not a surprise to anyone who had spent any time in the Northmore drawing room and heard what music sounded like played by someone who understood both the instrument and the composition. Clara was born with her father's dark hair and her mother's particular quality of stillness. The stillness that is not passive but alert, the stillness of someone who is taking in more than they are letting on. On an autumn evening in the 4th year of their marriage, Rosalind was at the estate desk in the morning room, Clara asleep upstairs, the accounts spread out in their orderly rows, the lamp casting its yellow circle, when she felt rather than heard Percival come to stand in the doorway. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, in the way he had of occupying space without requiring it to respond, and watched her work. She knew he was there. She had known for some minutes. She continued with the figures, the small, precise annotations, the ledger entries that would still be accurate 100 years from now if anyone cared to look. After a while, she said, "The East Tenant pasture renewal is settled, and the Ripon merchant has paid in full, which closes the last of the Halloway account." "Good," he said. "There is also a letter from the Alderton estate. They would like to discuss the lease term format for their lower holdings." "I see," he said. A pause. The lamp, the open window, the smell of autumn coming in from the walled garden where things were growing back, bed by bed, with the patient specific care of something tended properly. "Come to bed," he said. She made the final notation, precise, referenced, complete, and closed the ledger, and set down her pen, and turned to where he was waiting. She had been keeping things standing for a very long time. It was something else entirely now, to have someone standing alongside her.